Imagine sitting beside a gray trash can smelling of leftovers in a glittering room full of clinking champagne glasses. That was where my father seated me for my brother's biggest day, amid the mocking laughter of the elite. But his smug smile shattered into horror when one of the nation's most powerful men walked in, ignored the stage, and bowed deeply to the family failure. What followed tore apart over 30 years of lies. Hello, dear listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization features, leaving us with absolutely no budget to keep operating. If you find today's story engaging, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our channel has the funds to pay our hardworking staff, allowing them to afford their living expenses and continue creating amazing stories for you to enjoy. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the comments section of this video. Thank you so much for your kindness. My name is Ariel Estrada. I am 36 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been a ghost haunting the halls of my own childhood home in Seattle, Washington. My father, Julian Estrada, is a man who prays to only one God, and that God is the superficial worship of status, wealth, and public adoration. To him, a person's entire worth is neatly calculated by the designer label inside their suit jacket, the impressive title printed on their heavy cardstock business cards, and the sheer number of influential politicians they can casually invite to a Sunday brunch. In this toxic ecosystem, my older brother, Mateo, was the undisputed golden child. He was the living, breathing manifestation of everything my father considered perfect. Mateo was a corporate lawyer rising through the ranks at a breakneck speed. He was meticulously polished, endlessly charismatic, and possessed a ruthless social agility that always kept our father beaming with pride. Mateo knew exactly what to say, who to flatter, and how to make sure every single one of his professional victories reflected a blinding spotlight directly back onto Julian. I chose the exact opposite path. I abhorred the spotlight and preferred the quiet anonymity of the shadows. I told my family that I lived on the East Coast and worked in data monitoring. It was a deliberately dry, painfully mundane job description that I knew would instantly kill any follow-up questions from my father, but that boring life was a carefully constructed lie. The reality was that I served as a senior crisis coordination architect for Aegis Global Directive. We were a highly classified, top-tier private intelligence and security agency. We operated completely in the dark, executing missions far beyond the legal boundaries and jurisdictional reach of any traditional government entity. While my brother spent his days aggressively negotiating corporate mergers in plush climate-controlled boardrooms, I spent mine orchestrating the covert extractions of compromised assets from hostile war zones and dismantling catastrophic international cyber threats before they could reach the evening news. Naturally, Julian Estrada viewed my fake, mundane career as an unforgivable personal insult. He never missed a chance to publicly drag my name through the mud, using my supposed lack of ambition as a tool to entertain his wealthy guests. During our mandatory family dinners, surrounded by his country club friends, he would always steer the conversation toward my failures. "Look at Ariel," my father would announce loudly, holding his wine glass up as if making a grand toast. 36 years old, absolutely zero drive to succeed, and perfectly content living off 3 pennies a month. She is practically a parasite, tapping away at meaningless spreadsheets while her brother actually builds a legacy for the Estrada name. His friends would burst into loud, sycophantic laughter. Mateo would simply sit there, adjusting his expensive silk tie and offering me a tight, patronizing smile instead of defending his own flesh and blood. I never fought back. I would just sit in silence, taking a slow sip of ice water, letting their arrogant delusions wash over me. I knew exactly who I was, and I did not need their validation. Yet, despite the constant humiliation and the freezing emotional distance between us, I was still fundamentally human. Deep down in my chest, buried under years of tactical training and emotional compartmentalization, I still held on to a tiny, fragile shred of hope for genuine family love. I desperately wanted to believe that blood still meant something. That foolish, naive hope was the sole reason I agreed to board a 6-hour cross-country flight to return to Seattle. I was coming back to attend a massive celebration. Mateo had just been officially promoted to senior partner at one of the most ruthless and prestigious law firms in the state. I truly believed that showing up for his biggest milestone might bridge the massive divide between us. I walked into that magnificent hotel banquet hall with the cautious mindset of an outsider hoping to quietly observe. The room was breathtaking, dripping with opulent floral arrangements, blinding crystal chandeliers, and the unmistakable, suffocating energy of extreme wealth. I stood near the grand entrance in my simple black dress, genuinely happy for my brother's success, but I was terribly naive. I did not realize that my father had not invited me out of a sudden surge of familial warmth. He had not flown me out here to share in the joy. My presence in that room had been maliciously calculated by Julian. I was brought there to serve as a filthy, pathetic punchline, a living prop placed exactly where he wanted me, solely to make my brother's shining perfection look even more extraordinary by comparison. The grand ballroom of the downtown Seattle hotel was a suffocating sea of extreme privilege. Every inch of the massive space was engineered to scream old money and new power. Local politicians rubbed shoulders with conservative federal judges, while tech billionaires exchanged hushed whispers with ruthless chief executive officers. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos glided across the polished marble floor, carrying silver trays loaded with seared scallops and crystal flutes of imported champagne. The air was thick with the scent of expensive designer perfumes and roasted meats. The focal point of the room was a sprawling network of circular dining tables, each draped in heavy, flawless white silk. Sitting perfectly at the center of every bone china plate was a solid gold-plated name card, gleaming under the warm, amber light of the massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. I moved through the densely packed crowd, weaving around the trailing hems of expensive silk gowns and the sharp shoulders of custom-tailored Italian suits. I kept my eyes focused on those shining gold cards, searching for my own name. I started near the front of the room, right beneath the grand stage where a live jazz quartet was playing a smooth, upbeat melody. I checked the head table reserved for the most honored guests, the family section, and then the primary tier directly behind it, Table 1, Table 2, Table 10, Table 20. I circled the entire perimeter of the main seating area, politely stepping aside as laughing guests clinked their glasses and claimed their luxurious spots. My name was nowhere to be found. For a brief, fleeting second, I genuinely wondered if my invitation had simply been a clerical error overlooked by the event planners. But then, my eyes caught sight of a dim, neglected alcove pushed far back against the rear wall, completely isolated from the festivities. I walked toward the back. With every step, the sweet scent of expensive floral arrangements slowly gave way to the harsh, acidic stench of industrial cleaning supplies and the unmistakable sour odor of discarded food. Tucked away in the shadows, entirely separated from the sea of white silk tables, sat a single, flimsy gray plastic folding chair. It looked like it had been dragged out of a damp basement closet. Right beside the chair stood a massive, heavily stained gray industrial trash can, currently overflowing with scraped plates, half-eaten appetizers, and crumpled paper napkins. And there, slapped carelessly onto the seat of that cheap plastic chair, was a torn scrap of plain white paper. Someone had hastily scribbled my name on it using a cheap black marker. Ariel Estrada. No gold plating, no bone china, just a piece of garbage marking my assigned place beside the actual refuse of the evening. Before I could even fully process the sheer cruelty of the visual before me, a booming voice cut through the ambient noise behind my back. Well, look who finally found her designated zone. I turned around slowly to see my father, Julian, standing just a few feet away. He was flanked by a tight circle of influential city council members and a highly respected state senator. Julian gestured broadly toward me and the overflowing trash can, a malicious, theatrical grin plastered across his aging face. "You see, gentlemen," my father announced loudly, his voice carrying easily over the soft jazz music to ensure maximum audience participation from the surrounding tables. At Mateo's law firm, they have a strict policy: everything must be in its absolute proper place. It is a philosophy we apply to our personal lives as well, and naturally, things that possess absolutely zero value belong right next to each other. A vicious wave of chuckles rippled through the immediate crowd. The state senator smirked, swirling his whiskey, while the city council members openly laughed at the cruel punchline. My eyes immediately snapped over to Mateo. My brother stood just 10 feet away, perfectly framed by his adoring colleagues. He heard every single word. Our eyes locked for a fraction of a second, but instead of stepping forward to demand basic respect for his younger sister, Mateo quickly looked down at his expensive leather shoes. He turned his face away, cowardly choosing the safety of silence and the approval of his wealthy peers over defending my dignity. Julian stood there, his chest puffed out, waiting for the inevitable break. He was waiting for my shoulders to slump. He was waiting for my eyes to well up with humiliated tears. He desperately wanted me to turn around and run out of the service exit in a fit of absolute shame, cementing his ultimate, sadistic victory for the evening. He had no idea that a cheap bullying tactic from a narcissistic father was not going to make my pulse rise even a single beat. My heart rate remained at a perfectly steady 60 beats per minute. I did not cry. I did not storm off. Instead, I maintained steady, unblinking eye contact with Julian. I slowly reached down, deliberately pulled the flimsy plastic chair out from beside the overflowing gray trash can, and elegantly smoothed the back of my simple black dress. With the utmost poise and grace, I sat down on the cheap plastic. I crossed my legs, rested my hands neatly on my lap, and tilted my head slightly. A slow, chilling half-smile crept onto my face. It was a look of pure, unapologetic defiance. I leaned back into the uncomfortable chair, looking utterly relaxed, as if I had just taken the best seat in the house to watch a tragically amateur theatrical performance. The immediate silence that followed was deafening. My absolute calm acted like a bucket of ice water thrown directly over the smirking crowd. The chuckling abruptly died in the throats of the politicians. The atmosphere shifted instantly from cruel amusement to heavy, suffocating awkwardness, because I refused to play the role of the broken victim. Julian's grand joke suddenly fell completely flat, making him look less like a powerful patriarch and more like a petty, ridiculous old man. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his malicious grin faltering. He tugged at the collar of his custom tuxedo, a flicker of genuine confusion and vague unease flashing deep within his eyes. He had set a trap, but I was the one who just locked the cage. The ceremony was just minutes away from officially commencing. The master of ceremonies had already stepped up to the gold podium, lightly tapping the microphone to gather everyone's attention. Suddenly, the deep, guttural roar of heavy engines violently shattered the refined, carefully curated atmosphere. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the downtown streets, the crowd witnessed a convoy of 5 heavily armored black sport utility vehicles slam their brakes directly in front of the hotel's main entrance. The tires screeched violently against the pavement. The sheer aggression of the tactical maneuver sent the valets and doormen scrambling frantically for safety. Before the wheels even completely stopped spinning, the heavy doors of the vehicles flew open in perfect unison. Over a dozen elite security agents dressed in identical dark suits and wearing discreet earpieces poured out onto the street. They moved with terrifying, practiced military precision, aggressively pushing bystanders aside and instantly establishing a rigid, impenetrable security perimeter around the entire building. Inside the magnificent ballroom, the lively jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing. A jarring, discordant note from the saxophone hung awkwardly in the air for a brief second before dying out entirely. The resulting silence was incredibly thick and suffocating. The soft clinking of silver forks against bone china ceased. Every single head in the room snapped sharply toward the grand double doors of the entrance. The local politicians, conservative federal judges, and arrogant chief executive officers began frantically whispering to one another. Their hushed voices quickly formed a low, anxious, and chaotic hum. They were desperately trying to guess which monumental world-class figure possessed the kind of immense security detail that could forcefully lock down a busy downtown Seattle block in under 30 seconds. Julian's chest heaved with overwhelming, uncontrollable excitement. His eyes were wide, practically glowing with a manic, delusional pride. He aggressively grabbed Matteo by the shoulders, forcefully straightening his son's expensive silk tie and brushing an invisible speck of dust from his lapel. "Do you see this, Matteo?" Julian loudly hissed, his voice vibrating with absolute, intoxicating ecstasy. "Your sphere of influence has already reached the nation's capital. They are locking down the entire street for you, my boy. This has to be a United States senator, perhaps even a high-ranking federal cabinet member coming to personally congratulate you on your historic promotion. Stand up straight, push your shoulders back, make sure you look like the powerful man of the hour. This is the moment our family ascends to the true upper echelon." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were suddenly shoved wide open by two imposing security agents. They did not gently pull them, they pushed them with a force that made the hinges groan loudly. The low hum of panicked whispers instantly evaporated into dead, terrified silence. A tall, formidable man strode purposefully into the room. It was not a politician, it was Marcus Thorne. He was one of the most powerful, ruthless tech billionaires in the entire country, just 1 week prior. His sprawling global tech empire had narrowly escaped a catastrophic cybersecurity crisis that threatened to wipe out tens of billions of dollars and cripple the national digital infrastructure. His face was set in a furious, terrifying scowl. His dark eyes scanned the room like a predator evaluating a cage full of frightened prey. He radiated an aura of absolute, uncompromising authority that made the oxygen in the opulent room feel incredibly thin. The managing director of Matteo's prestigious law firm practically tripped over his own custom leather shoes as he frantically sprinted away from the head table. He dashed toward the grand entrance like a desperate, eager servant, extending both of his hands far in advance to greet the visiting tech titan. Julian, absolutely refusing to be outshined by anyone in the room, puffed out his chest even further and marched hastily right behind the director. I could clearly see Julian's lips moving silently as he walked. He was desperately rehearsing the most sycophantic, sickeningly flattering welcome speech he could possibly muster. He was more than ready to grovel at the billionaire's feet to secure even a tiny sliver of that immense, world-shifting power for the Estrada family name. From my dark, isolated corner near the back service station, I remained perfectly still. The faint, sour smell of discarded salmon and wilted salad from the overflowing gray trash can wafted past my face, but I did not blink. I slowly reached out and picked up my simple glass of ice water from the edge of the service counter. As the entire ballroom of several hundred elite, incredibly wealthy guests scrambled nervously to their feet in a collective display of terrified respect. I leaned back against the hard plastic of my folding chair. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the cold water. I was the only person in that massive hall who remained comfortably seated. I did not need to stand up and frantically guess why Marcus Thorne had suddenly descended upon a mid-level law firm promotion party on a Friday evening. I knew exactly why the powerful billionaire was standing there. The managing director of the law firm stood frozen in the center of the grand entryway, his right hand enthusiastically suspended in the empty air like a foolish, desperate beggar pleading for a copper coin. His meticulously practiced smile, designed to charm the wealthiest clients in the state, strained against his sweating cheeks. Marcus Thorne did not even break his stride. The billionaire did not offer a handshake. He did not offer a polite nod. He did not even offer the director the basic courtesy of a dismissive glance. Thorne walked past the highest-ranking executive of the firm with the chilling, absolute indifference of a man stepping over a puddle on the sidewalk. Right behind the rejected director was my father. Julian Estrada had practically folded himself in half, delivering a deep, sickeningly submissive bow that threatened to snap his aging spine. He began aggressively projecting his voice, launching into his overly rehearsed, sycophantic speech about the glorious partnership between technology and the law. He sounded like a cheap street vendor peddling fake watches. Thorne simply ignored him, the billionaire's broad, tailored shoulder brushed past Julian's trembling frame, leaving my father speaking to the empty air. Thorne planted his feet firmly at the edge of the grand ballroom. His sharp, predatory eyes swept over the massive crowd. He ignored the blinding crystal chandeliers. He ignored the multi-tiered cake, the expensive floral arrangements, and the velvet-roped VIP section where my brother was currently holding his breath. Thorne was searching for something specific. Then, his gaze bypassed the sea of white silk and gold-plated name cards. His eyes pierced through the shadows at the very back of the room. He locked eyes with me. Without a single word of explanation to the panicked hosts swarming around his security detail, Thorne began to march. He took long, aggressive, and decisive strides directly through the center of the room. He did not navigate politely around the tightly packed tables. He walked in a perfectly straight line. Powerful local politicians, conservative judges, and arrogant chief executive officers frantically scrambled to pull their chairs out of his warpath. They bumped elbows, spilled expensive wine on their custom suits, and knocked over silverware in their chaotic desperation to clear a path for a man whose net worth could buy their entire state. Julian, realizing that the most powerful man in the country was actively walking away from the stage of honor, snapped out of his dazed confusion. Total panic seized my father's features. He practically sprinted after the billionaire, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the polished marble floor. "Mr. Thorne." "Sir, wait," Julian stammered loudly, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered desperation. He chased after the towering man like a lost, frightened child. "You are heading in the wrong direction. The stage is up there. The table of honor for my son, Matteo, is right up there at the front of the room. There is nothing back here but the catering staff and the service exits." Marcus Thorne did not slow down. He did not acknowledge the frantic barking of the pathetic man trailing behind him. He marched straight out of the glowing amber light of the chandeliers and into the dim, sour-smelling alcove. He stopped dead in his tracks, right in front of me. The billionaire stood absolutely motionless. He looked down at the flimsy gray plastic folding chair beneath me. He slowly turned his head to inspect the massive, heavily stained industrial trash can overflowing with scraped plates and soggy napkins right next to my shoulder. Finally, he looked at the torn scrap of paper with my name hastily scribbled on it. The muscles in Thorne's jaw tightened until they looked like carved granite. The faint, polite neutrality he usually maintained for the press vanished entirely, replaced by a terrifying volcanic rage. The veins in his neck bulged against the collar of his shirt. He was looking at a scene of profound, calculated disrespect, and the sheer audacity of it left him visibly disgusted. "Ms. Estrada," Marcus's deep, resonant voice boomed, completely shattering the dead, terrified silence that had consumed the entire ballroom. His tone was laced with a lethal cocktail of disbelief and fury. "I owe you my life and the survival of my entire empire, only to find people seating you next to a pile of garbage like this." The sound of his words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Behind Thorne, Julian froze instantly. The delicate crystal champagne flute he had been tightly clutching slipped directly through his trembling fingers. It hit the solid marble floor, exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. The sharp, high-pitched crash of the breaking glass echoed violently through the silent hall, serving as the perfect auditory manifestation of Julian's shattered delusions. The collective gasp from the hundreds of elite guests sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The local politicians and wealthy socialites who, just 30 minutes prior, had been viciously laughing at my father's cruel joke about my lack of value, were suddenly drained of all their color. Their faces turned the shade of spoiled milk. They stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, their mouths hanging foolishly open. The realization was crashing down upon them with the weight of an anvil. The woman they had openly mocked as a parasitic failure was currently being addressed as a savior by a man who could destroy their entire careers with a single phone call. I did not break my composure. I kept my hands resting neatly on my lap. I looked up at the towering billionaire and offered him a light, perfectly polite smile. "It is quite all right, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of any anger or embarrassment. A seating arrangement does not define a person's inherent value, but I must admit, I am genuinely surprised you managed to find me hidden all the way back here. Without Marcus Thorne needing to utter a single command, his elite security detail immediately sprang into synchronized, ruthless action. Two hulking men in dark, tailored suits bypassed the discarded catering supplies and marched directly toward the closest reserved area. This specific table was currently occupied by a highly influential state senator and 3 prominent city officials. Without offering a single word of polite request or basic apology, the agents firmly grasped the edges of the heavy, silk-draped table and physically dragged it out of the way, sending silver cutlery and expensive crystal wine glasses rattling violently against the bone china. They were unceremoniously clearing a stage. Simultaneously, another security agent briskly walked over to the designated honor table, right at the front of the grand hall. He firmly gripped the back of the most luxurious, high-backed velvet armchair, a seat specifically intended for my brother, and carried it all the way to the dim, isolated rear of the room. He placed the plush velvet chair precisely in front of me, completely obscuring the view of the gray garbage bin. The visual hierarchy of the entire grand ballroom was violently dismantled and completely reconstructed in mere seconds. The center of absolute power was no longer the elevated, brilliantly lit stage at the front of the room. The undisputed center of gravity had shifted entirely to the gloomy, sour-smelling alcove where I remained calmly seated. As the staggering reality of the situation began to slowly permeate the minds of the attendees, a frantic, highly contagious panic rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests. The muffled, nervous rustling of expensive silk and tailored wool filled the heavy air as nearly every single person in the hall instinctively reached into their pockets or designer clutches. Within moments, the dim lighting of the ballroom was pierced by the harsh, bluish glow of hundreds of smartphone screens. The local politicians, the conservative judges, and the arrogant chief executive officers were all desperately typing my name into various search engines, frantically trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the quiet woman they had just openly mocked. I watched their faces from my seat, observing their expressions contort in a synchronized wave of deep confusion and rapidly growing terror as their search results loaded. They found absolutely no public social media profiles. There were no photographs of my face anywhere on the internet. There were no corporate press releases mentioning my professional achievements. I was a complete digital ghost. However, what they did manage to uncover, buried deep in the dark corners of global financial forums and heavily encrypted news boards, were scattered, terrifyingly vague anonymous whispers. They read fragmented, unverified reports about a highly classified, phantom operative known only as the Architect. They read terrified speculation from cybersecurity experts about a shadow organization called the Aegis Global Directive. The articles detailed how, just 1 week prior, an unprecedented, catastrophic cyber warfare attack aimed at entirely shutting down the national power grid had been quietly and surgically dismantled by this faceless architect. They were reading about the silent salvation of the American electrical infrastructure. Slowly, horrifyingly, the realization washed over the glittering crowd that the person responsible for keeping their lights on, keeping their banks functioning, and keeping their massive fortunes secure was the very same woman my father had seated next to the discarded appetizers. Near the front of the room, the managing director of the prestigious law firm slowly lowered his own cellular phone. The healthy, confident color had completely drained from his perfectly tanned face. He slowly turned his head to look at Matteo. The fawning but paternal pride he had directed at my brother all evening had instantly evaporated. It was completely replaced by a glaring, radioactive cocktail of deep suspicion and profound disgust. "Did you have any idea who your sister actually is?" the director hissed. his voice trembling with a barely contained fury that carried sharply across the hushed room. "Did you know what she does in the dark? And you dared to stand there in silence and let your father seat her next to a garbage receptacle at a firm event. What kind of weak, pathetic man are you?" Mateo, the golden boy, the ruthless corporate negotiator who prided himself on having a silver tongue, completely crumbled under the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of his superior. His polished, deeply charismatic facade melted away in an instant, revealing a terrified, utterly clueless child beneath the expensive suit. He opened his mouth to speak, desperately trying to formulate a defense, but no coherent words came out. He simply stood there, trembling visibly in his tailored clothing, stuttering out broken, nonsensical syllables. He was completely blind to my reality, and his ignorance was now his undoing. Observing his perfect, untouchable son breaking down in front of the city's elite pushed Julian entirely over the edge of sanity. His entire worldview, built meticulously upon a solid foundation of my deliberate belittlement, was violently cracking apart. He simply could not accept this new reality. The cognitive dissonance was too painful. He lunged forward, taking a desperate, uncoordinated step toward the towering tech billionaire. "Mr. Thorne, please, you must be terribly mistaken," Julian pleaded, his voice reaching a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed tragically off the high ceilings. Thick beads of sweat formed on his forehead, ruining his carefully styled hair. "There is a massive misunderstanding happening right now. My daughter is nothing but a low-level technical support worker. She monitors data spreadsheets for a living. She possesses absolutely no ambition. She does not have the capability, the training, or the intelligence to do whatever it is you think she did." Marcus Thorne did not merely turn around. He whipped his entire body toward my father with terrifying speed. The billionaire's dark eyes narrowed into deadly, piercing daggers, radiating an intense, lethal anger that made Julian physically recoil and stumble backward. "A technical support worker," Thorne echoed, his voice dropping to a low, incredibly dangerous growl that commanded the absolute, undivided attention of every single soul in the room. He took one slow, deliberate step toward Julian, invading his personal space and forcing the older man to cower defensively. The woman sitting behind me is the primary strategic brain who flawlessly commanded 40 elite international agents in the field. She is the solitary reason an unimaginable economic disaster did not strike the entire United States of America last Friday. She personally safeguarded millions of lives and billions of dollars while you were busy picking out luxury table linens. And you have the sheer, staggering audacity to look me in the eye and call her technical support. The air in the grand ballroom thickened into solid concrete. No one dared to breathe, cough, or shift their weight. The absolute, undeniable truth of Thorne's heavy words crushed the remaining air straight out of Julian's lungs. The grandiose, entirely fictional narrative that my father had meticulously woven and forcefully maintained for over 30 years was officially dead. The beautiful, shining illusion of Mateo's supreme greatness, built entirely by standing on my shoulders and pushing my head down into the dirt, had been ruthlessly torn to shreds in front of the most powerful people in the city, without waiting for anyone to formulate another pathetic excuse. Marcus Thorne abruptly turned his back on my trembling father. The billionaire marched purposefully toward the brilliantly illuminated stage at the front of the hall. He ascended the carpeted steps with heavy, authoritative strides, walking right past the meticulously decorated multi-tiered cake and the extravagant floral arrangements. He approached the golden podium and firmly snatched the microphone directly from the sweating hands of the master of ceremonies. He did not tap it. He did not introduce himself. He simply transformed my brother's majestic promotion ceremony into a glaring, inescapable spotlight of absolute truth. "Today, all of you gathered in this room to honor a young, supposedly brilliant corporate lawyer receiving a massive promotion," Marcus announced, his deep voice echoing like thunder across the paralyzed ballroom. "But I did not come here for him. I came here solely to honor the extraordinary woman currently sitting in the shadows of that back corner. She is a woman who silently protected millions of American jobs and countless innocent lives while expecting absolutely zero recognition. And how does her own flesh and blood repay her by publicly humiliating her? By treating a national hero like a piece of discarded garbage for your cheap entertainment. The heavy silence that followed his speech was absolutely lethal. The severe moral rot of the Estrada family had just been exposed under the harshest possible light. At the front tables, several of Mateo's most lucrative corporate clients exchanged dark, disgusted glances. One by one, these powerful chief executive officers and influential business partners pushed their chairs back and silently stood up, signaling their immediate departure. They refused to be associated with such a toxic display. The managing director of the prestigious law firm, his face still pale with absolute horror, stepped forward and looked down at my brother. "Your promotion to senior partner is immediately suspended, Mateo," the director stated, his voice dripping with pure, unfiltered contempt. "We cannot possibly hand the immense power and reputation of this firm over to a weak, spineless coward who refuses to even protect his own family from public abuse. Pack up your office first thing Monday morning." Mateo completely collapsed. His knees buckled beneath his expensive tailored suit, and he dropped heavily into his chair. He buried his perfectly groomed face in his trembling hands, entirely destroyed by the catastrophic loss of his glorious, meticulously planned future. Seeing his golden child utterly ruined, Julian completely lost his mind. He spun around and sprinted frantically back across the polished marble floor toward my dark, isolated corner. Tears of sheer panic and deep humiliation streamed wildly down his wrinkled face. He lunged toward me, dropping to his knees right beside the overflowing gray trash can. "Ariel, please," Julian sobbed loudly, frantically reaching out to grab the hem of my simple black dress. "Please, you must say something to Mr. Thorne. Tell him it was just a silly family joke. Tell your boss to forgive us. You have to save your brother's career. You have to save our family's honor." I slowly stood up from the cheap plastic folding chair. I did not violently pull my dress away from his grasping hands. I simply looked down at the pathetic, weeping man who had spent over 3 decades trying to make me feel entirely worthless. My eyes were completely cold, yet my soul felt incredibly, beautifully peaceful. "You were absolutely right earlier tonight. Father," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of any anger or sorrow. "Things that possess zero value truly do belong right next to each other. But today, watching you grovel in the dirt, I finally realized that I am the one who does not belong in this room." I offered a respectful, silent nod of gratitude toward Marcus Thorne, who stood proudly watching from the stage. Then, I turned my back on Julian Estrada. Escorted seamlessly by the billionaire's elite tactical team, I walked purposefully toward the grand exit. I did not look back. I left behind a completely broken father screaming in pure despair and a cowardly brother who had just lost everything he ever valued. The ultimate knot of my life was finally untied. I learned in that precise moment that the absolute greatest revenge is never about striking back in anger or seeking violent retribution. The greatest revenge is simply stepping aside and allowing toxic, arrogant people to completely incinerate themselves with their own massive egos, while you walk out the door, unburdened, and step peacefully into the bright light of your own truth. Thank you so very much, dear listeners, for staying with me until the very end of this emotional journey. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please let me know your city or country in the comments section below. If you found today's story engaging and deeply satisfying, please consider helping our channel with a small contribution of just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your incredible generosity allows us to pay our hardworking staff, helping them feed their families while we continue producing more high-quality stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart, and have a wonderful, peaceful day.